On the morning of July 7th, 1944, a wounded American soldier from Troy, New York, asked his friends for a favor. He was 28 years old. He was bleeding to death against a small tree on an island most Americans had never heard of. And he asked them for one thing before they left him: a pistol with 8 bullets. That was all. Not 7, not 9, 8. When they came back hours later, after the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War had rolled over them like a tidal wave, they found Sergeant Thomas Baker still sitting against that tree. The pistol was empty, and in the grass in front of him, in a rough half-circle, lay 8 dead Japanese soldiers. He had not missed a single shot. This is his story. And if your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, he knew men like Thomas Baker. He may have been one of them. To understand what happened on that morning, on that island in the grass in front of that unremarkable tree, you have to go back 4 years to a train platform in upstate New York in October of 1940. The war in Europe was 1 year old. Poland had fallen, France had fallen, Britain was burning, and the United States, officially neutral, was quietly beginning to build the largest army it had ever assembled. Thomas Baker was 24 years old when he stood on that platform with a small canvas bag in his hand. He was not a soldier by nature. He was not a hunter, not a boxer, not one of those small-town boys who spent his weekends looking for a fight. He was quiet, steady, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He came from Troy, an old industrial city on the Hudson River, 30 miles above Albany, a place of foundries and machine shops and Irish and Italian families whose sons had already served in the last war. In Troy in October of 1940, the leaves on the maples along Federal Street were turning red, and the smell of coal smoke was in the air. And somewhere on a radio, a Bing Crosby record was playing. His neighborhood knew what war did to young men. It sent them back changed. It sometimes did not send them back at all. He enlisted anyway. For nearly 4 years, the army did what armies do. It moved him, trained him, shipped him from post to post. He learned how to march, how to shoot, how to disassemble an M1 Garand blindfolded. He learned how to sleep in a tent full of snoring strangers. He learned how to write letters home that did not say very much. Every few weeks, a letter would arrive at the Baker family house in Troy, in his careful, upright handwriting. He would tell his mother about the weather and the food and the men he served with. He would not tell her the things he had begun to see. That was not how a son wrote to his mother in 1943. And he waited for a war that felt for a long time like it belonged to other men in other places. Then in the spring of 1944, the war came for him. His unit was the 105th Infantry Regiment of the 27th Infantry Division, a New York National Guard outfit, whose ranks were filled with men from Albany, Schenectady, Utica, and Troy. Many of them had grown up together. Some had gone to the same parish schools. One of them, a tall lieutenant colonel named William O'Brien, was from Baker's own hometown. O'Brien had served in the National Guard since the First World War. He was 44 years old for combat, old for anything that involved running through jungle under machine gun fire. And he was about to lead these men into the largest amphibious operation the Pacific had ever seen. Their destination was Saipan. Most Americans had never heard of it. It was a small volcanic island in the Mariana Chain, 13 miles long, 6 miles wide, roughly 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. On any map of the Pacific, it looked like a green fleck of nothing. But to the planners in Washington, Saipan was the key that opened the door to Japan itself. Capture Saipan, build airfields on it, then send the new B-29 Super Fortress bombers with their 4 engines and their 10-ton payloads from those airfields to the streets and factories of the Japanese home islands. Saipan was not a target. Saipan was the beginning of the end. The Japanese knew it too. They had 30,000 men dug into the caves and ridges of the island, infantry artillery tanks, and a garrison of the Imperial Japanese Navy that had been ordered to hold the island at all costs. They had built pillboxes into the coral. They had zeroed their guns on every stretch of beach a landing craft could reach. And their commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, a 53-year-old cavalry officer from a family with samurai roots, had been given a simple instruction from Tokyo. Do not surrender, do not retreat, die on this island. He intended to obey. On June 15, 1944, the United States Marine Corps hit the beaches of Saipan under a sky black with smoke. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions came ashore on the western coast in the first wave straight into machine gun fire and pre-registered artillery. Landing craft burned in the surf, men drowned under the weight of their own gear. The Marines took the beach anyway. The next day, June 16th, Baker and the rest of the Army's 27th Division landed behind them. For the next 3 weeks, they fought. They fought through cane fields and burning villages. They fought in caves where Japanese soldiers refused to come out and had to be sealed inside with satchel charges. They fought in the ruins of a sugar mill, in the streets of a town called Garapan, on ridges the Marines had named after the shapes of the corpses they left behind. Hell's Pocket, Purple Heart Ridge, Death Valley. Baker fought harder than most. On June 19th, 4 days into the battle, his company was pinned down by a Japanese machine gun position dug into a hillside. Men were dying in the grass. Officers were shouting orders that nobody could hear. And Baker quiet steady. Thomas Baker from Troy picked up a bazooka and advanced alone under direct fire across 100 yards of open ground. And when he was close enough to be sure, he fired a single rocket into the enemy position and destroyed it. His company advanced. Days later, he found a network of fortified Japanese positions, spider holes and bunkers with a total of 12 enemy soldiers inside, including 2 officers. He killed all of them, alone. Then on his way back to American lines, he discovered 6 Japanese infiltrators who had slipped behind his own regiment during the night. He killed those 6 too, 18 enemy soldiers, 1 rifleman, 3 weeks in. By the first week of July, the Japanese defense had collapsed to the northern tip of the island. Their backs were against the sea. Their supplies were gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which was supposed to relieve them, had been shattered in the Battle of the Philippine Sea 2 weeks earlier. 3 carriers sunk. More than 400 aircraft destroyed. No relief was coming. Ever. And here is the first thing you have to understand about the morning of July 7th. The great American victory at sea did not save the men on the island. It killed them. Because the moment the Japanese garrison learned the fleet was gone, the moment they understood that no ship and no plane would ever come for them, they stopped being a garrison. They became something older and stranger and more dangerous. They became men with nothing left to lose. Men with no future beyond the next sunrise. Men who had been raised on a code that told them death in battle was cleaner, purer, more honorable than the shame of surrender. 30,000 soldiers cornered on a piece of rock the size of Manhattan, with no way off and no reason to hold anything back. That is what was waiting in the jungle in front of Thomas Baker. On the evening of July 6th, in a command cave a few miles north of Baker's foxhole, Lieutenant General Saito gathered what was left of his officers. He was old. He was sick. He had been living on rice balls and river water for weeks. He looked at the men in front of him, most of them wounded, most of them starving. Some of them holding rifles with no ammunition, and he gave them a single word, Gyokusai. The word is Japanese. It means roughly shattered jewel. It is drawn from a classical Chinese proverb. Better to be broken as jade than to remain whole as tile. In the vocabulary of the Imperial Japanese Army, it had come to mean something very specific. A final charge, a suicide attack, no survivors. Every man who could still walk was to march south that night straight into the American lines and kill as many Americans as possible before dying. There would be no reserves, no fallback. No plan for tomorrow, because there was no tomorrow. Men who had no rifles were told to sharpen bamboo poles. Men who had no bamboo were told to tie bayonets to sticks. Wounded men who could barely stand were told to strap grenades to their chests and run. Saito finished the order. Then, in the small hours of the morning, he ate a final meal of canned crab and sake. He walked to the front of his cave. He faced east toward the emperor, and with the ceremonial short sword in the ancient ritual of seppuku, he took his own life. Nearby in another cave, a 57-year-old man with tired eyes was doing the same thing. His name was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. In December of 1941, he had commanded the 6 aircraft carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. He had launched the planes that started the war between Japan and the United States. Now 3 years and 7 months later, he was on a small island he had never planned to defend, watching an empire crumble around him. He put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. 2 of the highest-ranking Japanese commanders on Saipan were dead before the attack began. Their men would follow them into that darkness within hours. And this is the second thing you have to understand about the morning of July 7th. The soldiers who were about to run into Thomas Baker's rifle sights had no commanders, no plan beyond the direction of the charge, no expectation of surviving the sunrise. They were the last echo of an order given by a man who had already killed himself. They were not an army. They were a funeral walking. Baker did not know any of this. None of the Americans did. What Baker knew in his foxhole on the Tanapag Plain was that his regiment was thin, painfully thin. The 105th had been fighting for 3 weeks, and it was running short of everything: men, ammunition, sleep. His battalion, the 1st Battalion under Colonel O'Brien, was dug in about 250 yards inland from the beach. To the right, the 2nd Battalion under Major Edward McCarthy held a parallel line. Together, the 2 battalions had roughly 1,000 men, and between them, unseen, unmarked, and unguarded, was a gap. 500 yards of undefended coastal grass separating the 2 American battalions. It was a mistake, a seam in the line, the kind of thing that happens when tired men dig in fast on unfamiliar terrain in the middle of a long campaign. In peacetime, an inspector would have caught it. In a training exercise, an umpire would have flagged it. On the night of July 6, 1944, no one noticed. No one American, that is. Japanese scouts had been crawling through the grass for 2 nights. They had counted the American positions. They had mapped the machine guns. They had marked the gap. And when Saito's order came down, the Japanese knew exactly where to send the charge. Straight into the seam. Straight into the empty 500 yards where nothing stood between them and the American rear. Straight into the ground where Thomas Baker was crouched with 8 rounds in his rifle, and no idea that history was about to walk out of that jungle and find him personally. Somewhere south of him, in the grass along a shallow rise, stood a small tree, not much more than a sapling. It had grown there for years, unremarked, unnoticed. And it stood there still on the morning of July 7th, 1944, waiting. At 4:45 in the morning, the sake bottles in the tree line stopped clinking. The voices stopped rising. The jungle went completely silent. Baker lifted his head above the edge of the foxhole and listened. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no shells. Just the sound of his own heartbeat and the sound of 1,000 other men in 1,000 other holes, holding their breath at the exact same time. Somewhere in the darkness, a single voice began to scream, then another, then 100, then 1,000. And the darkness in front of Thomas Baker exploded into muzzle flashes and running shadows, and one word screamed from thousands of throats at once, rolling across the Tanapag Plain, like the sound of the world ending. Banzai. The first wave did not come at Baker. It came through him. They ran out of the tree line at a full sprint, 3 abreast, 4 abreast, sometimes 6 abreast, packed so tightly that a single American bullet could pass through 2 men and lodge in a third. They ran without cover, without pause, without any of the careful crouching movement that soldiers are taught in training. They ran the way a man runs toward the last thing he will ever do, Baker's M1. Garand came up to his shoulder before he had time to think. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. A man 20 yards in front of him dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Baker did not stop to watch him fall. He was already sighting the next one. Squeeze, drop, squeeze, drop. The M1 held 8 rounds in an internal clip, and when the last round fired, the clip ejected with a sharp metallic ping that every American infantryman knew by heart. Baker heard that ping and reached for a fresh clip without looking. His hands knew what to do. 4 years of training, 3 weeks of combat. He reloaded, chambered a round, and fired again. 10 yards, 8 yards, 5 yards. Some of them were close enough now that he could see their faces in the muzzle flashes. Young men, not much older than he was. Some of them not even that. He saw sweat and dirt and something else in their eyes, a kind of empty determination that had nothing to do with hate. They were not looking at him. They were looking through him. They were looking at whatever came after this life, and they were running toward it with everything they had left. He kept firing. Around him, the whole American line was firing. Rifles, Browning automatic rifles, water-cooled machine guns hammering into the darkness with long tearing bursts. Tracer rounds cut red lines through the pre-dawn gray. Grenades thumped and flowered in the grass. The Tanapag plain, which had been silent 5 minutes earlier, was now the loudest place on earth. And still they came. For every Japanese soldier who fell, 2 more stepped over his body. For every one of those 2 who fell, 4 more came behind. The math of it was impossible. Baker had killed men in this campaign. He knew how it worked. 1 bullet, 1 shot, 1 enemy soldier down and out of the fight. This was different. This was pouring water on a fire that would not go out. He could kill 10 men in a minute, and it changed nothing. The line kept coming. Within 30 minutes, the American perimeter began to fail. It did not collapse all at once. It came apart in pieces. A foxhole here overrun. A machine gun crew there silenced. A squad of 6 men on the flank suddenly cut off. Suddenly alone, suddenly fighting 3 directions at once. The 500-yard gap between the 1st Battalion and the 2nd Battalion, the gap no American had noticed, and every Japanese scout had mapped, became a river of running men. They poured through it. They kept going. They did not stop to consolidate. They did not stop to fight the units they had bypassed. They ran deeper into the American rear, screaming, firing, dying, and being replaced. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion on the right, would later try to describe what he saw that morning to a war correspondent. He struggled for the words. Finally, he said this: "It was like a cattle stampede. You were in a hole watching the herd come. And then they were leaping over you, and they just kept coming. I did not think they were ever going to stop. They did not stop." And here is something that the men in those foxholes did not understand until much later. Something that the newspapers back home would never quite report correctly. Not all of the men in that charge had rifles. American soldiers who lived through July 7th would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they saw when the sun finally came up. Bodies stacked in the grass, hundreds of them. And when the details were counted, some of those bodies were carrying weapons that no modern army was supposed to carry into a modern war. Bamboo poles sharpened at one end. Bayonets lashed to broken rifle stocks with strips of cloth. Kitchen knives tied to sticks. One man had a grenade in each hand and nothing else. No rifle, no pistol, no helmet. He had been ordered to run at the American line, pull both pins, and take as many enemies with him as the blast would allow. This is what a broken empire looks like when it stops pretending. The men who ran at Baker were not fanatics in the way that word is usually used. They were not smiling. They were not eager. They had been given an order by a man who had already killed himself. And they were carrying that order out because the alternative, surrender, capture, dishonor, had been drilled out of them since childhood. Some of them had families back in Osaka and Nagoya and Hiroshima who would never know how they died. Some of them were teenagers. Some of them had been drafted 3 months earlier and had never fired a rifle in combat until this morning. They were not an army. They were an execution running. Somewhere in the world at this hour, it was still Thursday afternoon. In Troy, New York, 6,000 miles and a full day behind Baker's mother was probably finishing the supper dishes at the kitchen sink. She did not know that her son had already been fighting for 2 hours. She did not know that a telegram was being written for her in careful War Department language in a room she would never see. She would learn all of this later the way American mothers learned everything in those years, from a boy on a bicycle carrying a yellow envelope up Federal Street. Baker's rifle jammed at some point during that first hour. He never knew exactly when. Carbon, sand, blood. The M1 was a reliable weapon, but no weapon is reliable enough for what was happening on the Tanapag Plain that morning. He worked the bolt, nothing. He worked it again, still nothing. A Japanese soldier came up over the lip of his foxhole with a bayonet, and Baker used the jammed rifle as a club. He drove the butt of it into the man's face. The man went down. Another one came. Baker swung again. The stock cracked on the third swing. He was at that moment a wounded and exhausted American infantryman with a broken rifle in his hands, and thousands of enemy soldiers still moving through his position. He did what soldiers do. He looked for another weapon. There was a dead man 3 feet away, an American he had known or half known from another platoon, and Baker took that dead man's rifle. He kept fighting. 20 yards behind him, a New York lieutenant colonel with white hair and 2 pistols was doing something that would become legend. Colonel William O'Brien, 44 years old from Troy, was walking up and down the front of his shattered battalion. Not crawling, not crouching, walking, upright, fully visible. A pistol in his left hand and a pistol in his right, firing at any Japanese soldier who came within range. His men, some of them wounded, some of them out of ammunition, saw him standing there like a statue in the middle of the chaos, and something in them refused to run. If the old man was still up there, they were still up there. That is how battles are held. Not by tactics, by one man refusing to break. O'Brien would not survive this morning. He did not know it yet. Or maybe he did. 200 yards further back at the artillery park, the men of the 10th Marine Regiment were watching the Japanese charge break out of the infantry line and keep coming. Marine gunners, big men, trained on 105mm howitzers designed to lob shells at targets miles away. Their guns were pointing north toward positions that no longer existed. There was no time to redeploy, no time to call for orders. The battery commander made a decision that violated every manual in the United States Marine Corps. He ordered the howitzers lowered, not aimed, lowered. Barrels cranked down until they were nearly horizontal, nearly level with the ground, pointing at running men 100 yards away. He then ordered the crews to fire. The first blast tore a hole through the charge that 10 men could have walked through. The second blast filled that hole with more Japanese soldiers who kept coming. The gunners fired again and again and again. Each shell fused to explode almost the instant it left the barrel. The concussion knocked helmets off American heads 20 yards behind the guns. The muzzle flashes lit the entire plane like lightning. The barrels overheated. The paint blistered and peeled. One gun cracked its recoil mechanism from firing too fast at too low an angle. Another began to droop from the accumulated heat. And still the charge came. And still the Marines fired. When the tubes were too hot to touch, and the ammunition was almost gone, and the Japanese were 50 yards away, and closing the battery commander gave one last order: destroy the guns. Thermite grenades went into the breaches. The howitzers, the pride of the 10th Marines artillery pieces worth their weight in gold in the middle of a Pacific island, were reduced to melted, useless iron in a matter of minutes. The Marines took what small arms they had and fell back on foot. They had held for as long as any artillery unit in the war had ever held. By 7 in the morning, the Japanese had pushed more than 1,000 yards past the original American line. The 1st and 2nd battalions of the 105th were no longer coherent units. They were fragments. Small pockets of men fighting alone in the grass, cut off from each other, running low on ammunition, surrounded by dead. And somewhere in one of those pockets, wounded and bleeding, was Private Thomas Baker. He had been hit by grenade fragments. Nobody wrote down the exact moment. It could have been the first hour. It could have been the second. What is known is that by the time the sun cleared the trees, Baker could not walk on his own. His legs were not working the way legs are supposed to work. There was blood on his uniform in more than one place. Some of it was his, A fellow soldier from his company found him. The man's name has not survived cleanly in the records. What survives is what he did. He picked Baker up, slung him across his shoulders in a fireman's carry, and started walking south toward the rear, toward the aid stations, toward the ships offshore that had doctors and bandages and morphine and a way out of this hell. They got about 50 yards. Then a bullet found the soldier carrying Baker. He went down hard. Both men hit the ground. Baker rolled onto his back in the grass and stared up at a sky that was finally turning gray with morning. The soldier next to him was clutching his side and gasping. Alive, wounded, not going to be carrying anyone anywhere. Two wounded Americans lying in the open in the middle of a battlefield that was still not finished with them. Baker turned his head. "Go," he said. The other soldier tried to protest. Baker cut him off. He was quiet about it. There was no drama in it. He just told the man what needed to happen. "Get up. Get back to the American line. Do not die here trying to save someone who is already dying. Do not add another body to this field on my account." The soldier hesitated. Baker said it again. "Go." The soldier crawled away. Then a few minutes later, another American came through the same stretch of grass, falling back, looking for a way out. He saw Baker lying against a shallow rise in the ground, alive, conscious, bleeding, and he stopped. "Come on," the second soldier said. "I got you." Baker shook his head. He told the soldier in words the man would remember for the rest of his life to leave him and save himself. The second soldier stared at him. You have to understand what he was looking at. He was looking at a man he had probably eaten breakfast with the day before. A quiet man from Troy, New York, who had never asked for anything, who had walked into machine gun fire with a bazooka 3 weeks earlier, who had killed 18 enemy soldiers by himself. This was that man, lying in the grass, bleeding, telling him to walk away. American soldiers are trained from the first day of basic that you do not leave your wounded. It is the first commandment of the infantry. You do not leave them, ever. Alive or dead, they come home with you. But Baker was not asking. He was telling. And then he made one more request. He pointed to a small tree maybe 10 feet away, a slim thing, not much more than a sapling. The same small tree that had stood there in the grass since before any American had ever set foot on Saipan. He asked the soldier to prop him up against it, sitting, facing the direction the Japanese were coming from. He wanted to see them when they came. The soldier did it. He dragged Baker to the tree and set his back against the trunk and helped him sit up straight. Baker's legs stretched out in front of him. His hands rested on his lap. Then Baker asked for one more thing. A pistol. The soldier, this man whose name we do not know for certain, but whose memory of this moment we will never lose, reached down to his own holster and drew his sidearm. It was an M1911, the standard American service pistol, a heavy, blocky .45 caliber weapon that had been carried by American soldiers since the First World War. Reliable, slow to fire, devastating at close range. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 round already in the chamber, 8 bullets total. He handed it to Baker. Baker took the pistol in his right hand. He checked the magazine. He checked the chamber. He counted slowly the way a man counts money when there is not much of it left. Then he looked up at the soldier standing over him. He did not thank him. He did not say goodbye. He nodded once. It was enough. The soldier turned and ran. He did not look back for a long time. When he finally did, from 100 yards away, through the smoke and the grass and the dawn light beginning to spread over the Tanapag plain, he could still see the shape of Thomas Baker sitting against that tree. Small, still. The pistol raised in his hand, facing the direction of the enemy, waiting. If your father or grandfather came home from the Pacific in 1945, this is the kind of thing he never talked about at the dinner table. This is the kind of thing he carried alone for 40 years and then took to his grave. Somewhere in every American family with a Pacific veteran, there is a silence shaped exactly like Thomas Baker sitting against that tree. By noon on July 7, 1944, the loudest morning in the history of the Pacific War had gone quiet. Not silent, never silent. The wounded were still crying out. Corpsmen were still calling for stretchers. Somewhere in the grass, a Japanese soldier who had refused to die was being finished by a bayonet. But the great screaming wave, the wall of running men that had come out of the trees at 4:45 in the morning, was over. It had broken itself against the American line. It had run out of men. On the Tanapag Plain, the numbers began to be counted. More than 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the grass. Some in neat rows where machine guns had caught them. Some in tangled heaps where they had fallen on top of each other, trying to climb over the bodies of the first wave. Some sitting up against tree stumps and coral outcrops alone, as if they had simply chosen a place to stop. On the American side, the 105th Infantry Regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 406 of its men were dead. 512 more were wounded. Nearly 80% of its effective strength had been erased between 4:45 and 11 o'clock in the morning. Whole platoons were gone. Whole companies had 2 or 3 survivors. There were foxholes on that plain where every man in the hole was killed and never fired a shot because the wave had come too fast. Colonel William O'Brien was one of the dead. The men who found him where you would have expected. On the very front of what had been his line. Not in his command post, not behind cover. He had run out of pistol ammunition sometime in the second hour of the attack, and when he did, he climbed onto a jeep-mounted Browning .50 caliber machine gun. A big weapon, a crew-served weapon, meant for 2 men and a stable mount. O'Brien fired it alone, standing upright on the jeep, feeding the belt with his own hands until the Japanese swarmed the vehicle. The last man to see him alive said he never sat down, never took cover, never stopped shouting encouragement to soldiers who could no longer hear him over the noise. They found his body next to the jeep, facing north, toward the enemy. Half a mile away in what had been a battalion aid station, they found Captain Ben Salomon. Salomon was the regimental dentist, 29 years old. A Jewish kid from Milwaukee who had gone to dental school at USC and been drafted into the army before he ever pulled a private patient's tooth. On the morning of July 7th, he had been running a field aid station for wounded American soldiers when the Japanese charge broke through and reached his tent. What happened next was not supposed to happen. It was not in any manual. It was not permitted by any treaty. Salomon was a medical officer, protected by the Geneva Convention, forbidden from taking offensive action. He did it anyway. He grabbed a machine gun. He told the walking wounded to get out. He held the line by himself for as long as he could hold it. When American troops recovered his position later that day, they counted 98 dead Japanese soldiers piled in front of the machine gun. Salomon's body was still at the trigger. He had 76 wounds on him. At least 24 of those wounds, the corpsman said, had been inflicted while he was still alive, which meant he had been shot and bayoneted, and shot again, and kept firing, and kept firing, and kept firing. 2 Medal of Honor moments on the same morning. 2 extraordinary deaths, and they were not done. Because somewhere on that plain in the grass and the smoke and the drifting cordite of the aftermath, a small burial detail was walking south along the withdrawal route where 2 wounded soldiers had stopped hours before. One of those soldiers had made it back to American lines. He had told his story to anyone who would listen. He had described a tree, a slim tree, a wounded private sitting against it with a pistol in his hand. They were looking for that tree. They found it. Thomas Baker was still sitting against the trunk. His back was straight. His legs were stretched out in front of him. His right hand held the M1911 in his lap. His eyes were open. He was dead. The soldiers who found him did not speak for a long time. There were things they were trained to do at a moment like this. Check for a pulse. Retrieve the weapon. Note the position of the body for the graves registration report. But they did none of it for a while. They just stood there. Because in a rough half-circle around the tree in the grass in front of where Baker had been sitting, lay 8 dead Japanese soldiers. 8, not one more, not one less. The pistol in Baker's hand had a full magazine capacity of 7 rounds, with 1 round in the chamber for a total of 8. When the sergeant of the burial detail carefully removed the M1911 from Baker's hand and checked the action, the pistol was empty. The magazine was empty. The chamber was empty. 8 bullets. 8 enemy dead in front of him. That is what the men who found him remembered. That is what they told their squad mates and their platoon leaders, and eventually the officers who came to gather statements for the recommendation that would follow. It is the story that walked out of that grass with those men on the afternoon of July 7th, 1944, and it is the story that has walked with the United States Army ever since. The official Medal of Honor citation, when it was finally written, would put it more carefully. It would say that Baker's body was recovered and that the pistol was found empty, and that 8 dead Japanese soldiers were found in the immediate area of his position. The citation, being a legal document, does not describe the arrangement of the bodies. It does not claim in official language that Baker killed all 8 men with those 8 rounds. The soldiers who found him made no such careful distinction. They knew what they had seen. 2 days later, on July 9, 1944, American forces declared the island of Saipan secure. Of the roughly 30,000 Japanese defenders who had been on the island in June, nearly 29,000 were dead. Only about 1,000 were taken prisoner, and most of those were Korean laborers who had been conscripted by the Japanese military and did not want to die for an emperor who was not theirs. The war for Saipan was over. The tragedy of Saipan was not. In the days that followed, American soldiers on the northern cliffs of the island witnessed something that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Japanese civilians, women, children, entire families had been told by their military that the American soldiers would rape, torture, and murder them if captured. They had been ordered by the same officers who had ordered the Banzai charge to kill themselves rather than surrender, and they did. Mothers threw their babies into the sea from 300-foot cliffs and then jumped after them. Old men held their wives' hands and stepped off the edge together. Teenagers grouped in small circles and pulled the pins on grenades. American Marines on the beach below shouted through megaphones, "Please, please stop. We will not hurt you." Some of the civilians heard them, some believed them, most did not. Those cliffs would be given names in the years after the war. Suicide Cliff, Banzai Cliff. Today there are stone memorials there. Japanese tourists come to lay flowers. American veterans come to stand in silence. It is one of the quietest places in the Pacific and one of the saddest. And it is part of the same story as Thomas Baker's tree, because it is what happens when an empire tells its people that death is more honorable than surrender. Meanwhile, in Troy, New York, on a summer afternoon whose exact date has been lost to time, a boy on a bicycle rode up Federal Street with a yellow envelope in his hand. He stopped in front of the Baker family house. He walked up the steps. He knocked on the door. That is how Mrs. Baker learned her son was dead. That is how thousands of American mothers learned it in thousands of small houses in cities and towns, from Maine to California in the summer of 1944. A boy on a bicycle, a yellow envelope, a knock on the door. The paperwork on Thomas Baker began to move through Washington. His company commander wrote the recommendation. It went up through battalion, through regiment, through division. Statements were gathered from every man who had witnessed Baker's actions across the 3 weeks of the Saipan campaign. The bazooka charge on June 19th, the 12 Japanese soldiers killed in the fortified positions. The 6 infiltrators eliminated behind American lines. And then on the morning of July 7th, the refused evacuation, the tree, the pistol, the 8 rounds. Colonel O'Brien's recommendation moved through the same channels at the same time. 2 men. Same regiment, same city back home, same day, same battle. On May 9, 1945, one day after Germany surrendered and the war in Europe ended, The War Department announced that both men would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. Baker was posthumously promoted from private to sergeant so that the citation would carry the rank the Army felt he had earned. The medals were presented to the families in ceremonies that same month. Captain Ben Salomon, however, received no medal that day. The Army knew what he had done. The witnesses were clear. 98 dead Japanese in front of one machine gun operated by one man. The recommendation for Salomon's Medal of Honor was written the same summer as Baker's and O'Brien's. It should have been announced with theirs. It was not. Because Ben Salomon had been a medical officer, and the Geneva Convention signed and ratified by the United States prohibited medical personnel from using offensive weapons against enemy combatants. The letter of the treaty was clear. It did not matter that Salomon had used the machine gun to protect wounded men who could not protect themselves. It did not matter that his last act had been the defense of a hospital tent. The rules said what the rules said, and the Army, unwilling to appear as if it were endorsing a treaty violation, even in the case of a hero, quietly shelved the recommendation. It stayed shelved for 58 years. 3 American presidents came and went before it was reopened. A generation of Salomon's fellow soldiers grew old and died before his name was cleared. It was not until 2002, in a White House ceremony conducted by President George W. Bush, that Captain Ben Salomon finally received the Medal of Honor that had been earned on the morning of July 7, 1944. He was the only military dentist in American history to receive it. There is a lesson in that, and it is not a comfortable one. It is that history is not always fair, and it is not always fast, and the country that men die for does not always know how to honor them in real time. Baker and O'Brien got their medals within a year. Salomon waited more than half a century. 3 men, same morning, same regiment, same courage, different fates. Thomas Baker was brought home from Saipan and buried at the Gerald B. H. Solomon Saratoga National Cemetery in Charlottesville, New York, about 30 miles north of the city of Troy, where he had grown up. His grave is marked with a simple white headstone, identical in every way to the thousands of other headstones around it, except for a small inscription that identifies him as a Medal of Honor recipient. Visitors who do not know the story walk past without noticing. Visitors who do know it tend to stand for a long time. 3 miles south of Saipan, across a narrow channel, lies the island of Tinian. Tinian was captured by American forces in the weeks immediately following Saipan. It fell quickly because the great Japanese defense of the Marianas had already bled itself out in the caves of Saipan and on the grass of the Tanapag Plain. Once secured, Tinian was rapidly developed into the largest airbase in the world. American engineers laid down 4 parallel runways, each about 8,500 feet long, nearly 2 miles. They called it Northfield. From that airfield on the morning of August 6, 1945, a single B-29 superfortress named the Enola Gay took off carrying a single bomb. The bomb was called Little Boy. Its target was the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, from the same airfield, a second B-29 named Boxcar carried a second bomb to Nagasaki. 6 days after that, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito went on the radio and told the Japanese people that the war was over. There is a straight line you can draw. It runs from a tree on the Tanapag Plain, through 8 expended pistol rounds, through the deaths of 406 men of the 105th Infantry Regiment, through the capture of Saipan, through the capture of Tinian, through the runways of Northfield, through the bomb bay of the Enola Gay, to the moment the war ended. It is not a comfortable line. There is no clean way to talk about it. But it is the line that exists, and every American who came home from the Pacific in 1945 came home along that line, whether they knew it or not. Thomas Baker did not know it. He could not have known it when he asked for that pistol, when he counted those 8 rounds. When he nodded once and let his friends go, he was not thinking about atomic bombs or empire's ends, or the runways that had not yet been built on an island he had never seen. He was thinking about the men he was about to protect for a few more minutes with the last bullets he would ever fire. That was enough. That is always enough. He was 28 years old. He was quiet. He was from Troy, New York. He had spent almost 4 years in an army uniform and less than 1 month in combat before it killed him. He was not a professional warrior. He was a citizen. He was the kind of man this country has produced in small, quiet numbers in every generation since it began. Men who do not ask to be heroes. Men who do not expect to be remembered. Men who, when the moment comes, sit down against a tree with 8 bullets and face the direction of the enemy because there is no one else left to do it. The men who left him there lived long enough to tell what they saw. They told it to their children. Their children told it to their grandchildren. It became one of those stories that gets passed from one generation of American families to the next, quietly at kitchen tables on Memorial Days at VFW halls in small cities across the country. It became one of the stories this country carries. You are one of the people carrying it now. If you drive north on Route 4 out of Albany, past the old paper mills and the Hudson River bridges, past the small towns where the American flag still hangs from every other porch. On the 4th of July, you will come to Schuylerville, New York. And in a cemetery there among thousands of white headstones identical to each other, you will find one that says Thomas A. Baker, Sergeant, 105th Infantry, 27th Division, Medal of Honor, Saipan. If you are ever nearby, stop. Stand there for a minute. You do not have to say anything. He will know. Sergeant Thomas A. Baker, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. Died July 7, 1944 on the Tanapag Plain of Saipan at the age of 28. 8 bullets. He made every one of them count.